This module focuses on an introduction to power in urban regimes. We'll focus primarily on the writings of Clarence Stone and his urban regime theory, and look at the underlying principles related to that, as well as the different types of regimes that he has developed in his studies, particularly with Atlanta. But in order to be able to understand where Clarence Stone is coming from, we're going to focus also on two other theories of power. One is elite theory, popularized by C. Wright Mills, and then also pluralist theory, which was popularized by Robert Dahl and one of his students, Nelson Polsby. So let's start off with some background by examining the idea of elite theory. So elite theory came into prominence kind of in the late 50s, early 60s. And this theory kind of fought back and forth with the pluralist theory that we'll talk about in a couple of minutes. But Mill's theory was that the United States is run by a power elite that's composed of corporate managers, military leaders, and then actors inside of the federal government that worked alongside these other two pillars outside of the government, the formal structure of government. Their goal was to preserve the status quo, both inside and outside of the government. And primarily what gave them power was the belief that in the United States, the capitalist system and the economy ran hand in hand, and that we should leave the power over the economy to individual business interests so that they can produce the most efficient goods and services that we have at the most efficient prices. There's kind of consensus at this point in time that capitalism does work. We also had a consensus that experts were the ones that we should look to help solve the problems. So under the elite theory, we could take a look at the corporate managers who were running things as far as the economy was concerned, military leaders who were part and parcel of the Pax Americana during the Cold War, and the idea that ultimately we should let the experts do things, and the status quo of American capitalism was what was working. Now, basically, the power elite is able to maintain the status quo by basically, protecting the prevailing distribution of wealth and income in the country. And again, what that essentially means is that under the capitalist system, it should be the market that determines outcomes, not the government. As a consequence of that, we don't need large redistribution programs in the United States. Rather, we just need to leave it to the corporate elites to be able to create jobs, increase incomes, and build the economy. So, if that's the way the system works, then there's no real kind of revolutionary system that's percolating up from the bottom. Part of what makes this all work then is that instead of ceding control over the economy and people's lives to the government, the market takes control of that. And that's the organization of our work life, the price levels for the goods and services that we pay for, investments in the economy, and then expansions and mergers as well. These things take place in the private marketplace, the decision making not again with the government, but rather by these corporate elites. And part of the status quo also is a limited tax structure that focuses less on redistribution and more on just providing some basic social safety nets. If people, have some basics, they should be happy with it. And the kind of the idea that um, that a rising tide raises all boats, and that people get what they deserve and earn what they deserve is part and parcel of this background of the elite theory. And then finally, the people's belief in the protection of our capitalist system through a large military also helps preserve the status quo as well, and also helps ensure the growth of the economy. So, with the elite theory, basically what Mills is talking about is that there are a group of people that basically run the economy, and in running the economy, they also run the government. Government works hand in hand, both through public officials, military officials, and then corporate officials to run the economy of the US and run what's possible within the context of government, and doesn't leave quite as much room for the individuals in society, individual citizens or groups to be able to affect politics. Pluralism under Robert Dahl has a slightly different kind of attitude towards the exercise of power within American society. What Dahl says, and particularly in his seminal study of New Haven, Connecticut, is that there are multiple access points in American politics. So we have a federal system, we have separation of powers, checks and balances, so forth, which allows people to be able to mobilize and have their voices heard at various different levels, and it helps to incorporate more people into the decision-making process. So where the elite theory is focused predominantly on a series of people at the top of the spectrum making decisions, the pluralistic system says essentially that if you are interested in a certain public policy, if you are an interested public, you can basically mobilize on behalf of that interest and you will have your interest heard. And the question would be, well, why is that? Well, because people vote, and what we have is that public officials are concerned about not getting reelected. Therefore, government officials will do what people ask them for because they want to ultimately be reelected. And sometimes that is through the concept of what Dahl calls slack resources. And that is that if enough people are mobilized around a single issue, public officials will take that seriously and will push that agenda because they know that these people will show up in force when the elections come around. So not everybody's interested in every issue. However, from the pluralist side, power really rests in society to groups that actually mobilize. And if you can mobilize, whether you're a community group, whether you're a business group, a nonprofit group, a group of citizens, whatever the case may be, you are probably likely to be included in the decision-making process because of the fact that there are so many squeak points or access points in American politics. And that helps to cause some stability. When people get upset, when they mobilize, they're heard, but then they kind of go back and aren't really heard on other issues because they're not all that interested in it. So what Dahl sees is that, in each interest around a city, essentially you'll have different groups of people ruling, although there may or may not be a strong mayor that can kind of bring all these groups together. But power really is there and exercised by people who get upset about certain issues and decide to coalesce to affect the government. Now, Clarence Stone, in his regime theory, basically says, well, that's a little bit too neat and tidy for me to really think that that's the way that government works, right? And he says, in this big fragmented system that we have, you've got kind of formal power structures and informal power structures. So you've got the formal mechanisms of government, right? The public elected officials, bureaucracy at the city level, and so forth, and various kind of quasi-governmental commissions. But what we really need to understand when we study urban politics is what are the informal arrangements by which public bodies and private interests function together in order to be able to make and carry out governing decisions, right? So again, what we have is a system in which the government can't control everything. They can't just mandate that things happen. Rather, they have to build a coalition on an ongoing basis to help work out and build some sort of consensus around issues of importance. And what he wants to study then is, what are these informal arrangements? How do they manage conflict within a society, particularly a changing society, right? Cities are always undergoing different demographic changes, different economic changes. How do they respond to all these changes using kind of the informal arrangements that are part of the urban regime? Uh, Stone says that basically there are, differences from city to city, but there are two basic needs that push these informal arrangements to be able to occur. One is institutional scope, and that's the need to encompass a wide enough scope of institutions to mobilize the resources that are going to make and implement governing decisions. Right? So you have to take a look at what kind of type of resources and interests there are within the context of an individual city. and what is the scope of those groups that come together in order to be able to try to reach consensus through these informal arrangements. And integral to that idea is that we need cooperation. There has to be enough cooperation and coordination from those big, diverse, institutional scope from all the different participants to be able to somehow cobble together a consensus-oriented approach to a public policy problem, and then sustain the that policy that comes out through the implementation stage within the community itself, right? So, you know, it's a much different structure of studying power for Stone, much more fluid, and much more ongoing over time that we need to study how they deal with change. So, um, there are this whole mix of participants are basically in the background as basically two guiding principles. One is that there is a democracy of some sort, right? That there is popular control of government, that we have the ability to be able to influence what goes on in our cities vis-a-vis elections, vis-a-vis lobbying, vis-a-vis taking our interest to city officials. But then also recognizing that there is a private ownership of businesses within the community, and economic investment within the city is very important. And again, in some respects, the idea that you have the ability to exit as a corporation or the ability to be able to leave the city is what needs or requires the informal organizations to be built up in order to be able to kind of establish these urban regimes. So while government itself does kind of own some things, mass transit systems, convention centers, in many cities, stadium authorities own, venues where concerts and individual sporting events take place and all this kind of stuff. For the most part, private investment is what makes cities work. And the economic domain and economic development is really for the most part under the guise of private interests. So, from Stone's perspective, when we look at urban regimes and kind of past studies of power, particularly the pluralist and the elite theorist, they're looking at the wrong things. They're trying to see who has control over government, and assumes that in a fragmented, kind of disjointed, kind of diffuse power system that like we have in the United States, particularly with a city at the bottom of the intergovernmental pyramid. Cities have the least amount of power, in relationship to the federal government, to the state governments, that we just can't assume that things work really smoothly and any one person or one group of people really have control. It's a constant adjusting of the interest and coalescing in order to be able to drive a city forward. So, from his perspective, then, there's no comprehensive controlling regime that makes city politics go, right? Um, and in Stone's conception, the issue is how to bring about enough cooperation among disparate community elements to get things done, and to do so in the absence of an overarching command structure of a unifying system of thought. In other words, it's too simplistic to say that there's this elite out there that pulls the strings of power. That's not the way it works. Rather, it's a very kind of complex interaction between various groups in society that are working informally to cooperate with the government in order to be able to do the business of the city. And, that could be anything from, building an expressway in a city, creating entertainment districts or stadium districts, all kinds of development, creating, main streets within cities and redeveloping downtown districts, all these different types of things. In order for this all to happen, groups have to come together within society and give their input into the government in order to get buy-in for these things to happen. So, just as an introductory kind of concept of this, and we don't want to get deep into the specifics in this introduction, but basically, Stone says there are four types of regimes that are present within cities and urban regimes. And Of these four things, we start with the caretaker regime, the developmental regime, the middle class progressive regime, and then the lower class opportunity expansion regime. What we see is as we go from the top to the bottom, that there is an increase in the degree of coordination and mobilization, particularly among the public as you go down the list, right? So, with the caretaker regime, what Stone is essentially saying is this is a government that really is just organized around maintaining the status quo. I suppose, in some respects, similar to what you might see in Mill's elite theory. And he says that basically there is no real need for a great connection between the city leaders and the people or other groups because they're just preserving what's already there. There isn't a lot of innovation to have things move forward. Basically, you're just providing certain basic city services and not really trying to affect change. Then you have what's called a developmental regime. And the goal of this is to promote economic growth. And depending on where you are in the country and if your city's growing or not, preventing economic decline, which was the case, in many cities in the 60s and the 70s. And even now with the industrialization, the plight of many cities around the country here in the United States. So within the developmental regime, it's relatively easy to build consensus. City government comes up with big projects that they would like to organize and fund through private investment, as well as a bit of seed money from the city. There isn't a whole lot of conflict in these things, but typically there will need to be buy-offs of certain groups within the city. So if you are going to redevelop an area of the city that might displace a number of people and houses or community buildings, there'll be trade-offs where you have to give money to those groups to relocate or in some way give them some type of advantage through a public policy. So it's kind of like a side payoff. Then you have what's called a middle class progressive regime. And in this city, what you essentially see is that it's organized around kind of what we might call somewhat post-materialistic kind of objectives. And that is that you're focused on environmental issues, you're focused on the government being a more egalitarian in the way that it approaches incorporating people into society. And the goal here is for more redistribution. And somebody's got to pay for that. Often in these areas, what you see, there's a lot more community, individual belief that there should be a type of government that redistributes money to help everybody. And oftentimes businesses are somewhat peripheralized in this type of regime. And then finally, and this is kind of interesting, Stone talks about a lower class opportunity expansion regime and says that this is really not something that's in play currently in the American urban experience, but would be a system that's set up essentially to be able to pull people that are lower class, maybe have been disadvantaged communities over the period of time, maybe not as much education, and that the structure of government services should be around improving the conditions for lower income people with a much bigger redistributive system than you'd see even in the middle class progressive regime, right? So in this system, basically what we have is a really interested public that is out in an effort to be able to build human development within the context of that city. And all the interests in these different things change, right? So the level of business power changes as well. The caretaker regime, developmental regime, more business power, the middle class progressive regime, the lower class opportunity expansion regime, the more power that individual citizens and citizens groups have within the context of these regimes. Now, finally, and again, this is just an introduction to help you understand a bit about how these regime functions, but we see a typology that's been developed by Stone. And he says that we can take a look at two kind of factors in the typology. What are the market conditions? In other words, what's the situation of business within a community? And second of all, what are what we would call the local democratic conditions? In other words, individuals' ability to be able to affect change within politics. And that creates this four different kind of regime types that we could see here that create different types of interaction and cooperation. So let's just take the local democratic conditions. You have turnout is important. How involved are individuals within their government? Are they very politically engaged, or are people mildly disassociated from the political system and don't really participate very often? Second of all, what's the style or the setup of the institutions of government within that city? Are our public officials elected from the ward area, in other words, from local neighborhoods, or are they citywide elections, where basically you don't have the neighborhood connections? There's at large people being elected. And if you have ward elections, basically, and Stone's typology, you're going to have more attentiveness to what people want as opposed to the citywide elections or the at-large elections, where oftentimes the voices of those people who are more disadvantaged in society are often not heard. On the top, then, under the market conditions, we have essentially the idea of how easy is it for a business to be able to move out of an area, and how interesting is your city to businesses to want to relocate to. So there are certain cities in which, they're always growing. They're always an advantage, regardless of cost or public policy, to have your business located in that area. And then there are other areas in which you could easily move the services out to another city or offshore them. And in those highly mobile communities, it's much more difficult to be able to affect change because business has the right to go on strike and has the right to exit, right? All businesses do, but it would be easier to exit in that kind of highly mobile export-oriented city. So how do the different politics kind of occur? How do the different coalitions and cooperations within these regimes make a difference? So essentially, what you see is that Stone sees the best conditions for a more small d democratic polity when you have big citizen attraction to voting and have local ward elections, and you've also got business that really can't leave a city, and your city's in a pretty strong financial position. Why is that important? Well, A, you have businesses, don't have as much power because they aren't going to leave the city just because of public policies that are passed by the city. People are much more attentive to the policies of the cities, and all people are included because you have kind of the voices of the various neighborhoods. And what we see there is that, citizens groups and individuals have much more negotiating power vis-a-vis business, which brings a more socially inclusive kind of progressive regime. Uh, in the same guise, if you were in a low turnout city where people were not as engaged in politics and you have at-large elections, again, cities, the businesses can't really leave or won't leave because they want to stay there because you've got a thriving, base and a thriving economy. That people will have more negotiating power vis-a-vis businesses in order to be able to get into part of that urban regime. But because again, you have citywide elections rather than kind of these neighborhood elections, you're not going to see them be as inclusive of all the economic and ethnic and social uh, diversity that you would see within the city. So we're in the best situation, really, Stone says, for citizens when business, you got a good, healthy city that business wants to stay in. They'll pretty much accept, whatever policies are passed. On the other hand, business's ability to be able to negotiate when the economy is not so great. There's the ability to be able to move out of the city and move to another city without really any economic consequences for the business. They have the power of exit. We don't see as many advantageous things for citizens or citizens being part of the cooperative kind of mechanisms of the urban regime. Um, so what we'll see is in a highly mobile, export-oriented city with high turnout and ward elections, um, business doesn't really become as involved in kind of the progressive politics of the city. And while there may be, more collective benefits offered because people are attuned to the politics that are going on, you don't have as much cooperation between business and the rest of civil society there, as well as the government. And then finally, if you live in a regime or a city in which there is a highly mobile business and not a lot of citizen participation and kind of these citywide at-large elections, there isn't as much bargaining power and resource mobilization for groups across the city that are kind of non-business, non-governmental, and kind of the least amount of democratic participation in those regimes. So again, just to sum up here, when we take a look at Stone and looking at the urban regime theory, we see that the fragmentation of government, there's a lot of uncertainty. In order to be able to carry things out, government can't do things by itself. Business doesn't have the power to do any but things by itself. Rather, we have informal networks that work together to get things passed. And the question is, what type of informal mechanisms are there? And depending on the resources of the city, depending on people's civic and political engagement, we can have different outcomes in different types of regimes.